My name is Natalie Pierce. I'm 31 years old, and I found out that $2 million dollars can move faster than a heartbeat when someone gets access to the right form. I never liked talking about life insurance. It felt like tempting fate, like speaking your worst fear into the air and hoping it stayed polite. I kept my policy for the same reason I keep spare batteries and an emergency kit in my trunk. Not because I expect disaster, but because I refuse to let disaster become chaos. The policy started as a requirement, not a choice. My job offered a base benefit, and I took the optional increase when I was promoted into a role that involved travel and long hours. Then, after a coworker died unexpectedly and left his partner in a mess of paperwork, I doubled it again and added a private policy to cover the gap. $2 million dollars sounds like a headline. In my world, it was a safety net, a mortgage payoff, my mother's medical care if she ever needed it, and a clean runway for the people I love if I disappeared. The beneficiary list was simple. Primary beneficiary, my best friend, Leah Grant. Contingent beneficiary, my younger brother Owen. I didn't pick Leah because I didn't love my family. I picked Leah because Leah respects my boundaries and follows instructions without improvising my life into her own story. Leah is a paralegal, detail-oriented, stubborn, and immune to guilt. Leah is also the person who held my hand through my worst breakup and never once tried to manage me like a project. My family, on the other hand, has a history of turning concern into control. My mother, Diane, has always believed she knows what is best for me. She uses soft language, warm hugs, and a tone that implies I am still a child who needs direction. She also has a talent for making any boundary feel like cruelty. I learned to keep my life compartmentalized, not to punish anyone, to survive. So when I updated my beneficiary list a year ago, I didn't announce it. I filled out the change form online, saved the confirmation PDF in a locked folder, and moved on. Then a random Tuesday in late October turned my careful planning into a fight for my own identity. The day started with a headache. Not a normal headache. A bright, sharp pain behind my eyes that made light feel loud. I tried to work through it. I drank water. I took a break from my screen. I blamed stress. The pain didn't care about my schedule. By noon, nausea joined it. By early afternoon, my vision started to blur at the edges. My coworker looked at me and went pale. My face was wrong. My speech was wrong. My hands were clumsy. The next minutes moved fast. An ambulance, a mask, a paramedic explaining something about blood pressure and neurosigns. My phone placed into my palm like a lifeline. I remember one clear thought. I do not want my mother making decisions. That thought surfaced the way instincts surface when you're scared. I tried to call Leah. My fingers missed the screen twice before the call connected. Leah's voice reached me through the siren noise, steady and focused. I explained what I could: hospital, severe symptoms, tests. Leah responded with the kind of calm that becomes structure. Share your location. Send a screenshot of your insurance card. Confirm your hospital password preferences. Hospital password. Yes. Immediately. I typed a password into my notes app. Not obvious, not sentimental, not related to my mother's world. Then my phone battery dipped low, and the screen dimmed. The paramedic noted they were taking me to Evergreen Medical Center. Then the fog thickened. The emergency room became ceiling tiles and fluorescent glare. I remember a CT scan. I remember a doctor explaining a ruptured aneurysm risk and the need for urgent intervention. I remember signing something with a shaky hand and being rolled into a place that smelled like disinfectant and cold air. Then the world went away. When I woke up, time didn't feel linear. It felt like blinking through layers. A nurse adjusted my IV. A monitor beeped. My throat felt raw. My head felt heavy. Leah sat in a chair by the window, a coffee cup on the floor near her foot, like she didn't trust herself to look away long enough to hold it. The relief of seeing her hit me so hard my eyes burned. Leah's face stayed careful, calm, but tight. Something happened. Leah noted, and the words were shaped like a warning. My stomach sank. Leah slid her phone across the bed carefully. The screen showed an email. Subject: Beneficiary change confirmation. Carrier: Stonebridge Life. Timestamp: Yesterday. My mind tried to reject the image. Yesterday I was fine. Yesterday I was at work. Yesterday I ate takeout and complained about traffic. Yesterday, no one had any reason to change my life insurance. I scrolled. The email confirmed a successful change. New primary beneficiary: Diane Pierce, my mother. I stared until the letters blurred. No, I breathed. Leah watched my face. The hospital admitted your mom as next of kin before I got here, Leah noted. The intake desk contacted her because your phone emergency contact list still had her. She arrived early, pushed through with a tone that convinced people she was already in charge. My emergency contact list. I had forgotten that old detail. Leah continued. Your mom tried to block access. She tried to get information without the password. She also tried to get into your personal belongings. Security stopped her after the charge nurse placed restrictions. My heartbeat spiked. How did she change my beneficiary? Leah opened a folder on her lap and slid out 2 pages, already printed. An online change request can't happen without account access, Leah noted. The carrier confirmed the change came through an agent-assisted call with identity verification. Agent-assisted call. Identity verification. I felt cold. Leah pointed to a line on the carrier's call summary. Verification method, security questions, and document upload. My mother had been my keeper of documents since childhood. Birth certificate, social security card copy, old tax forms. The archive of my life filed in her home like she owned it. She also knew my childhood answers. First pet, street name, favorite teacher. The kind of questions people choose when they want the illusion of security. Leah had written down the carrier's process steps. 1. Call agent services. 2. Confirm policy number. 3. Pass verification. 4. Submit beneficiary change form via secure link. 5. Agent stamps the request as urgent due to medical event. 6. Change takes effect within hours. Medical event. My mother used my surgery like a lever. I tried to sit up and pain flared behind my eyes. Leah's hand lifted, gentle but firm. Stay down, breathe, we can fix it. Fix it. The phrase hit me strangely. Because my mother uses that phrase as a cage, Leah used it like a plan. Leah had already started. She obtained a copy of my last beneficiary confirmation PDF from my cloud folder because I had shared it with her months ago after a conversation about adult paperwork. She also had a notarized statement ready, drafted by a colleague, confirming I had been incapacitated during the time window of the beneficiary change. Incapacitated. The word mattered. If I was under anesthesia or impaired, a change made in my name was not a change. It was exploitation. Leah also had something else. A note from the hospital's neurosurgery team documenting the exact time I was sedated and the exact time the procedure began. Timestamps, paper beats performance. The carrier's fraud department returned Leah's call that afternoon. I listened on speaker, while Leah handled the verification with my hospital password. The fraud representative confirmed the change request, the agent notes, and the fact that my mother had submitted a photo of my driver's license as part of the verification. My driver's license. Leah's voice remained level. Where did she obtain it? The representative noted they could not speculate, but could document the concern as identity compromise. Leah requested an immediate freeze on beneficiary changes pending investigation. The representative resisted initially with policy language and authorized agent phrasing. Then Leah used a sharper tone and referenced the medical incapacity documentation and the hospital timestamps. The representative's tone shifted. A temporary hold was placed. Temporary, not enough. Temporary is where disasters hide. Leah requested a formal reversal to the last confirmed beneficiary designation, effective immediately. The representative noted reversals require review. But an emergency escalation could occur if there was evidence of fraud and imminent risk. Imminent risk. I was still in a hospital bed. I was still vulnerable. The risk was not hypothetical. Leah requested the escalation and emailed the documentation to the fraud team while still on the call. The representative confirmed receipt and opened a case. A case number arrived. That case number became my anchor. My mother arrived the next morning. I didn't see her enter, but I heard her voice in the hallway, bright and emotional. The tone she uses when she wants strangers to view her as loving. The charge nurse stopped her before she reached my room. Hospital policy required the password. My mother tried anyway. She tried 3 different phrases. She tried my childhood nickname. She tried my birthday. The password did not move. She began crying loudly in the hallway. The sound was familiar. A performance designed to make authority figures uncomfortable enough to give in. The nurse did not give in. Security arrived. Quiet, professional, neutral. My mother's voice sharpened when her tears failed. I have legal rights. I'm her mother. I make decisions. The nurse's response stayed calm. The patient has capacity and has restricted access. You can leave voluntarily or you can be escorted. My mother's footsteps retreated, then stopped, then retreated again. The silence after felt heavy. Leah exhaled. Your mother has never been blocked like that before, Leah noted. That was true. My mother has always moved through my life like doors open for her. Now a door stayed closed. That door was a password and a policy. I discharged 3 days later with strict instructions and a head full of fog that slowly began to clear. Leah moved into my apartment for a week because I wasn't supposed to be alone. She organized medications, meals, and follow-up appointments with the same precision she uses to organize court exhibits. I focused on one goal: restoring my beneficiary list and preventing a repeat. The carrier's investigation moved at a pace that felt insulting. Business days is a cruel phrase when your life is on the line. Leah pushed them daily. I gathered evidence. My phone records showed no outgoing call to the carrier. My location history showed I was in the hospital during the call time. The hospital records confirmed sedation. The agent notes showed beneficiary change requested by mother on behalf of insured. On behalf of. Those words are how control hides. Leah also requested the agent call recording. The carrier initially resisted. Then Leah referenced the open fraud case and requested it through compliance. A week later, we received a transcript summary. The voice on the call was a woman. The woman claimed to be me. The woman referenced a recent near-death experience and a desire to protect family. The woman pushed urgency. The agent attempted to confirm identity with security questions. The woman answered correctly. The agent sent a secure link. The woman completed the form. The woman uploaded a photo of my ID. The agent processed it. Reading it felt like watching someone wear my skin. My stomach turned. My mother didn't just want the money. My mother wanted the role of rightful receiver, the final authority over my story. $2 million was the trophy. Control was the point. I confronted the one detail that made everything possible: the security questions. I logged into my carrier portal and changed them all, but that was too late. The problem was deeper than answers. The problem was the system's assumption. If someone can answer, they are you. I requested a higher security level, a voice passphrase, a code sent to a new email, and a ban on agent-assisted changes without in-person notarized documentation. The carrier offered a high fraud alert profile. I demanded it. Leah also recommended I change my driver's license number because the ID photo had already been used. I visited the DMV with my discharge paperwork and filed a report for identity misuse. Identity misuse is a phrase that sounds small. It can ruin you. I also froze my credit. I added a fraud alert. I created a new email address used only for financial accounts. I moved all sensitive files into encrypted storage. I removed my mother as emergency contact everywhere. I treated my life like a system under attack, because it was. My mother escalated when the soft route failed. A package arrived. Inside, my childhood scrapbook, a bundle of old photos, and a note that tried to make love feel like obligation. You always overreact. Families take care of each other. I had to make sure you were protected. You should be grateful someone loves you enough to handle things. Handle things. That phrase again. Under it, a new line. If you keep blocking me, I will call the carrier myself and explain you are confused. I will fix it. She believed my recovery fog made me weak. She believed I would choose peace over protection. She had chosen the wrong moment to test me. Leah drafted a no-contact letter through a cooperating attorney, referencing the open fraud case and warning that further attempts at impersonation would be escalated to law enforcement. I mailed it certified. Certified mail is a boundary with tracking. My mother hates tracking. The carrier's decision arrived 12 days after discharge. Fraud determination, probable identity impersonation. Action. Beneficiary designation restored to prior confirmed record. Additional action. Permanent security lock on the policy, requiring dual verification and notarized forms for any future beneficiary changes. I stared at the confirmation email until my eyes stung. Leah exhaled like someone releasing a weight. Restored. Restored is a beautiful word when your name has been used like a tool. But restoration didn't erase the attempt. The attempt changed something in me. I could have accepted the outcome and moved on. Many people would. It is exhausting to push further when the immediate crisis ends. I didn't push further because I wanted revenge. I pushed further because I wanted it to stop. I filed a police report for identity theft and attempted financial fraud. The amount was not stolen, but the attempt targeted a $2 million benefit. That detail made the report feel different. The detective's posture changed when I mentioned the policy value. $2 million attracts attention. My mother had believed my family relationship would shield her from consequences. Consequences do not care about family titles when documents exist. I provided the fraud case number, the carrier transcript summary, the hospital sedation record, the timestamps, the no-contact letter, and the package note. The detective opened a case, another case number, more anchors. My brother Owen tried to mediate, which in my family means carrying my mother's emotional strategy into a softer voice. Owen called, and I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened to the message, because Owen isn't the villain, just the person who hates conflict more than he hates manipulation. The voicemail was full of phrases that used to work on me. Mom is scared. Mom is stressed. Mom thought she was helping. Why can't you just forgive, forgive, forgive without change as permission? I didn't call back. I texted Owen one line. Communicate through Leah or counsel for anything involving the policy. Owen responded with a few words that confirmed the reality I already knew. Mom is devastated. She feels betrayed. Betrayed. The person who attempted to steal $2 million felt betrayed by my boundary. That inversion is my mother's specialty. I didn't correct it. I stopped participating. 3 months later, I attended my first follow-up appointment that felt routine instead of terrifying. My scans looked good. My blood pressure stabilized. My energy returned slowly. Healing is strange. Your body improves while your trust stays injured. Leah moved back to her life, but the habit stayed with me. Passwords, locks, logs, receipts, copies. I also created a will, not because I expected to die, because I refused to let anyone write my ending for me. Leah became my executor. Owen became a contingent point of contact, with limitations. My mother's name was not included. I added explicit language, no fiduciary role, no decision-making authority, no access to accounts. It felt harsh on paper. It felt peaceful in my chest. My mother's last attempt arrived in the form of an apology that never mentioned the crime. A letter in neat handwriting, full of emotion and vague regret. I'm sorry you felt scared. I'm sorry the hospital treated me badly. I'm sorry you are pushing away the people who love you. I only wanted to protect you. No mention of impersonation. No mention of beneficiary change. No mention of $2 million. Just a request for access again. I placed the letter in my file folder labeled Evidence. Then I went for a walk. The air was cold and sharp, and the city felt normal again, which I no longer take for granted. I used to think the worst thing that could happen to you is a medical emergency. Now I know the worst thing is waking up from that emergency and realizing someone tried to profit from it. I'm 31. I'm an American woman. And I no longer confuse family involvement with safety. Safety is a system. Safety is consent. Safety is the ability to say no, even when someone calls it betrayal. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder. I learned to treat every help offer like a question. If it requires access, it requires consent. If it requires urgency, it requires verification. If it requires secrecy, it requires refusal. $2 million is loud, but boundaries are louder.